History began not with a thunderous roar, nor with a creative whisper. It began with a sudden, deafening silence. It was the silence that follows the dry, sickening impact of rock against flesh and bone, the silence of a world tasting its first intimate death at the hand of a brother, in a field still fragrant with the scent of new earth, where dewdrops clung to blades of grass. The blood of Abel seeped into the soil. It did not flow like a stream, but spread like a dark ink, writing the first and bleakest chapter of mankind. Cain stood there, the air trapped in his lungs. He felt no victor's pride, no release from the burden of his envy. There was only a hollow abyss, a void carved into the center of his soul, as cold and vast as a starless night sky. And then, from within that crushing stillness, a voice arose. It did not come from the clouds above, or echo from the distant hills. It rose from the very earth that was drinking the blood, and from within the chambers of Cain's own consciousness a voice as ancient as stardust and as heavy as bedrock, bearing the weight of all creation. "What have you done?" The voice was not an interrogation. It was a statement of fact, a mirror held up to the chasm that had just opened within Cain. The ensuing dialogue was not an accusation, but a reshaping, a painful and permanent inscription upon the very being of the first murderer. The curse was not to be a simple banishment, not chains or whips. As the Creator passed judgment, a beam of pure, raw light as brilliant as the core of a newborn sun descended upon Cain. The light caused no physical pain, left no scar, no burn upon his sun-toughened skin. Instead, it passed through flesh and bone and branded an invisible mark upon his perception itself, upon the delicate veil that separates the seen from the unseen. In a moment both fleeting and eternal, the familiar world before Cain's eyes fractured into a million kaleidoscopic shards. The sky was no longer a single shade of blue, but a tapestry woven from infinite hues of indigo, violet, and emerald that the mortal eye could not resolve. The ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. It trembled with the memory of millennia, of tectonic shifts and primordial formations. He saw layers of reality superimposed upon one another, translucent as silk veils. Beside the solid, gnarled tree stood its spectral, shimmering afterimage from 1,000 years past, when it was but a seed. In the whisper of the wind through the leaves, he heard not just the movement of air, but the murmurs of creatures that had never been named, the echoes of songs that had never been sung. His world had been torn asunder. He had torn the life from his brother, and now the very fabric of his reality had been ripped in two. The mark was not a punishment for others to see and shun him by. It was a far crueler curse, one that forced him to see everything, to see what hid behind the thin curtain of the physical world, to see the echoes of the past, the phantoms of potential, and the primordial entities that humanity was never meant to know. Cain collapsed, clutching his head, overwhelmed not by guilt, but by the horrific sensory overload. He screamed, but his cry was lost in the cacophonous symphony of dimensions that only he could hear. He had become the only truly lucid being in a blind world, and that was his own private hell. His journey east, to the land of Nod, was not a migration across a physical landscape, but a listless drift between the seams of reality. Nod could not be found on any mortal map, for it was not a territory of soil and stone. It was a state of being, an interstitial realm, a misty hinterland, where the material world and the world of echoes bled into one another in a chaotic fusion. Cain walked, but each footstep landed on a different surface, a different sensation. His heel would feel the damp moss of a present-day rock, while the ball of his foot sank into the hot, crystalline sand of a forgotten prehistoric desert. The air he breathed carried the scent of wildflowers from the path ahead, yet was tinged with the saline tang of an ancient ocean that had evaporated eons ago. The scenery around him flickered and shifted like a candle in a gale. A gentle hill might, for a moment, shimmer with the spectral image of a roaring volcano, only to dissolve back into a barren field. He was more alone than any creature had ever been, yet he was never truly by himself. The ghosts of the earth's memory drifted past him like formless winds. His mark-branded eyes could now perceive them. He saw herds of colossal beasts, their hides shimmering with a pearlescent light, striding majestically across lands that were now nothing but desolate hills. They did not notice him, for he existed on a different frequency of reality, but their presence made the air heavy with pressure. He heard the resonant songs of primordial forests, where sky-piercing trees sang their own epic sagas. In the very place he saw only scrubland. His initial, desperate cry to the Creator, "Whoever finds me will kill me now," took on a new, more profound and terrifying meaning. The enemies he feared were not future tribes or vengeful kin. His enemies were invisible and omnipresent. They were the aggrieved echoes of a world he had wounded, the primordial entities and natural consciousnesses that had been stirred into discord by the imbalance his act had created. Every time he crossed a stream, he felt the resentment of the water, for Abel's blood had stained the ground. Every time he leaned against a boulder to rest, he felt a disturbance in the rock's memory, a dissonant vibration that had never existed before. He was a discordant note in the grand symphony of existence, and every element of that symphony now seemed to be trying to expel him. Sometimes, during the endless nights, as he huddled by a meager fire, the phantoms from the world of echoes would draw closer. They had no distinct shape, merely shimmering masses of energy, curious and, at times, radiating a cold menace. They were the spirits of place, the consciousnesses that had never known man, and they sensed the tear he carried with him like an open wound. He learned to survive in this maddening new world. He learned to distinguish a real rock he could sit on from the memory of one he would fall through. He learned to follow the more stable currents of energy, the invisible paths in the echoscape. His exile was not a punishment to wander the earth, but a sentence to wander between the layers of reality, forever a stranger everywhere. After days, or weeks, or perhaps years, had dissolved in his perceptual delirium, when exhaustion had gnawed its way to his very marrow, Cain began to sense a different kind of signal. Amidst the maddening symphony of chaotic echoes, there was a single, clear, and persistent note, a frequency of pure tranquility. It was like an invisible lighthouse in the storm of his senses, and with an instinct he didn't know he possessed, he staggered towards it. The closer he got, the fainter the overlapping spectral images became, and the screaming cacophony in his mind softened to a murmur. Finally, he stood before a place unlike any he had ever seen. It was an oasis, but not of water and palms. It was an oasis of pure, untainted harmony. A garden nestled in the heart of the chaotic land of Nod, where the light seemed gentler, the air purer, and everything existed in a state of perfect equilibrium. This was no imitation of Eden. It was older, wilder, possessing a primordial beauty that had never been touched by any hand. This was the Garden of Echoes, where the memory of the earth was preserved not as haunting phantoms, but as a harmonious melody. And there, in the heart of the garden, he met her. She did not appear suddenly from behind a bush or emerge from a cave. She seemed to have always been there, an inseparable part of the garden itself. She sat beside a pool of water, so clear it seemed like liquid crystal, its surface perfectly still, reflecting a sky that did not exist in Cain's world. Her long hair held the deep brown of ancient bark, shot through with strands of silver that shimmered like lichen in moonlight. Her skin had the color of rich, damp earth, and her eyes, when she lifted them to look at him, held no specific color but the depth of the earth itself, containing the stillness of millennia. Her garments appeared to be woven from leaves and spider silk, blending seamlessly into the scenery. She did not speak, yet Cain heard her voice clearly in his mind. It was not made of words, but of a serene melody, a flow of pure meaning that brought an impossible peace to the lingering chaos in his head. The one who bears the mark, she addressed him, not by his name, but by his new essence. The resonance in his mind held no judgment, no fear, only a deep recognition, a calm understanding. You have brought the tear in reality to my doorstep. Cain was stunned. For the first time since leaving the presence of the Creator, he had met another being who could see him, who understood his condition. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and words felt like a crude, inadequate tool to communicate with her. She seemed to understand. "I do not know the God who branded you," her melody continued in his thoughts. "But I know the heartbeat of this world. I am its guardian. My kind has been here since the earth was learning its first song. It is our charge to listen and to maintain the balance of the echoes." She rose, her movements as graceful as a falling leaf. And for the first time in countless ages, that song has a discordant note, a note of violence, of life willfully taken. That note is you. The tear you carry is not yours alone. It is making the world of echoes bleed. Her deep eyes bored into Cain's, not to accuse, but to show him a truth far greater than his own guilt. The meeting between Cain and the Guardian was unlike any encounter in the young history of humankind. There were no greetings, no probing questions, no suspicion. There was only the immediate recognition between two contrary essences. One, the embodiment of chaos, the bearer of the tear in reality. The other, the embodiment of harmony, the keeper of the earth's primordial rhythm. They sat together under the canopy of a colossal tree Cain had never seen before, its leaves emitting a soft, silvery luminescence. The space around them was silent, yet it was a living silence, pulsing with energy. Their eventual union was not sanctified by any ritual, oath, or deity. It was a pact, forged in that profound silence, a wordless agreement woven from desperation and responsibility. Through streams of melodic thought, the Guardian explained to Cain the full consequences of his actions, consequences that reached far beyond the death of one man. "Your act," she conveyed, "was more than the taking of a life. It was the first time the consciousness of a creature turned against its own kind, with the intent to extinguish. It created a hole in the tapestry of existence, a wound through which chaos is now seeping from your material world, poisoning the world of echoes. The phantoms you see, the sounds you hear, they are the symptoms of a fever the world now suffers." She looked at Cain, and this time, within her thoughts, he saw an image of himself. He saw the mark on his soul not as a brand, but as a focal point, a vortex that was both drawing chaos in and radiating it out. He was both the curse and the epicenter of the curse. His very existence, in this state, was a constant threat to the balance of all things. But her melody shifted, carrying a fragile sliver of hope. Where there is a wound, there is also the potential for healing. She held out her slender hand, palm facing upward. A soft, green light emanated from it. "My bloodline carries the primordial energy of balance. We do not rule or command. We simply exist as an anchor, keeping the world's symphony in tune. I am the last." A profound sadness touched her thoughts. "I can help you, and in doing so, help this world. I can use my very being to mend the tear you have created." Cain, for the first time in a long while, felt something other than fear and torment. It was awe. He did not fully comprehend her words, but he understood sacrifice. How? He finally managed to rasp, his voice hoarse from disuse. The Guardian did not answer with words. She looked directly into his eyes. In their depths, he saw a vision of their union. He saw his own chaotic, fiery red energy merging with her harmonious, verdant green energy. They did not cancel each other out. Instead, they twisted together, forming a new, stable yet volatile strand of power. "By joining with you," she explained, "my essence will become an anchor, binding itself to your chaos. It will not disappear, but it will be contained. It will not spread further. Our union will create a new bloodline, a temporary reconciliation between the two worlds. It was an unbelievable offer and a terrible burden. She would willingly bind herself to his hell to save her paradise. She would share his curse, feel a part of his madness, to bring stability to all things. Cain looked down at his own hands, the hands that had been stained with his brother's blood. He was not worthy of this sacrifice. But as he looked past the borders of the garden, at the chaotic phantoms still lurking in the mists, he knew he had no choice. Selfishness had led him down this path. Perhaps a selfless act, even one of mere acceptance, was the only way to begin to atone. In the silence of the garden, he slowly, solemnly, nodded his head. The birth of Enoch was not heralded by celestial omens or ancient prophecies. It was a quiet event that took place in the heart of the Garden of Echoes, a secret kept from the eyes of both heaven and earth. The child was the living embodiment of the pact, a tangible fusion of chaos and harmony. From his first moments as an infant in his mother's arms, Enoch was different. His eyes, a miraculous blend of his father's earthen brown and his mother's colorless depth, did not seem to look merely at the physical world. They looked through it. When Cain held his son, he could feel the infant gazing at the invisible mark upon his soul, not with fear, but with a serene curiosity. The boy did not cry often. Instead, he would make soft, melodic sounds, little tunes that seemed to be in dialogue with the rustling of the leaves or the gurgle of a nearby stream. For Adam and Eve in a distant world, lineage meant continuation, the multiplication of man's image. But for Cain and the guardian, Enoch was something else entirely. He was not merely human. He was a hybrid being, a living bridge built across the chasm separating two realities. As he grew, Enoch's unique abilities became more pronounced. He could hear the song of the rocks, a slow, majestic melody that told of eons of pressure and transformation. He could feel the sorrow of the river as it flowed through barren lands. He could see the invisible streams of energy that flowed through all things like threads of light, connecting trees, soil, and living creatures in a complex web. The mark in Cain was a curse, a shattered door that left him drowning in the chaos of dimensions. But in Enoch, that same potential was inherited and tempered by his mother's blood. He too could see and hear the world of echoes, but not as a maddening cacophony. He perceived it as a grand, intricate symphony, with its own rules, melodies, and harmonies. Enoch spoke little with his mouth. Human language seemed too restrictive, too imprecise to describe the things he perceived. Instead, he communicated in other ways. He would sit for hours, tracing complex shapes in the air with his finger. To Cain's mark-enhanced sight, these invisible lines would glow, revealing diagrams of energy, equations of sound, and sacred geometries that described the very structure of the cosmos. He was the first in creation to understand the language of the universe, not through bestowed words, but through innate vibration. The guardian, his mother, understood her son perfectly. She taught him how to listen, how to differentiate the melodies, how to find the harmony even in the most seemingly chaotic of sounds. She showed him how to touch a tree lightly to feel the life-giving sap flowing within, and how to press his ear to the ground to hear the planet's heartbeat. Cain, on the other hand, both loved and feared his son. Enoch was the living proof of his sin, but also his only hope. It was through the presence of Enoch and the guardian that the raging storm in Cain's mind was soothed. The mark was still there, but it was no longer an open wound. It was encased in a protective sheath of harmony generated by his small family. He would often watch his son play, not with toys of wood or stone, but with the streams of light and sound that only he could see. Enoch could cup the echoes of the wind in his hands, forming a swirling ball of energy, then release it to fly away like an invisible bird. He could coax a wilting flower back to life by humming a melody he heard from the earth, causing it to perk up once more. Cain realized that his son was more than a bridge. He was a potential regulator, a nascent conductor who might one day be able to command the symphony of reality itself. And that realization filled him with a mixture of profound pride and a vague, unsettling fear for the future. As Enoch grew, Cain became aware of an inescapable truth. The Garden of Echoes, for all its harmony, was fragile. It was a sanctuary maintained by the Guardian's presence, but beyond its borders, the chaotic world of Nod was an ever-present threat. The entities stirred by Cain's mark would sometimes still try to intrude, drawn by the unique energy signature of Enoch, a fierce, protective instinct. A drive he had never known while living with his first family rose in Cain. He could not lose another family member. He had to build a shelter, a fortress that could defend, not just against physical threats, but against the unseen forces that only he and his son could perceive. The idea of a city began to form, but this was not a city to be born of ambition or a desire to rule. It was born of love and fear. Cain began the work with the brute strength of a man accustomed to labor. He moved massive stones, felled sturdy trees. He quickly realized, however, that physical might alone was insufficient. A stone wall could stop a beast, but it could not block a malevolent echo or a non-corporeal entity. It was at this moment that Enoch's role became paramount. The boy, now a young adolescent, came to his father's side. He said nothing, merely placing a hand on a giant granite boulder Cain was struggling with. He closed his eyes, and Cain, through his mark, could perceive a fraction of what his son was doing. Enoch was not just feeling the weight and texture of the stone. He was listening to its song, sensing its natural resonant frequency, and finding the precise location in space where that stone would harmonize most perfectly with the earth beneath it and the stones around it. Under Enoch's guidance, the construction was utterly transformed. It was no longer manual labor. It became a sacred art, a process of creation based on the profound laws of the universe. Enoch showed his father how to place stones at precise angles to create a stable energy grid that would regulate the flow of echoes passing through. He taught him how to build walls that were not merely thick, but had specific curvatures and openings that acted as metaphysical acoustic filters, deflecting hostile frequencies and amplifying harmonious ones. The city's center was not a palace or a square, but a hollow tower, built according to a complex geometric ratio that Enoch had heard from the stars. This tower acted as both a lightning rod and an amplifier, drawing the harmonious energy from the nearby garden and broadcasting it throughout the city, creating a safe zone, a bubble of equilibrium. They named the city Enoch, after its greatest architect, the child of two worlds. The city of Enoch possessed no grand, ostentatious beauty. Its beauty was in its subtle harmony. The streets curved to follow the earth's invisible ley lines. The houses were built of stone and wood, each material chosen not just for its durability but for its tonal timbre. The entire city was a colossal musical instrument, perfectly tuned to play a song of peace. The Guardian observed the construction with quiet satisfaction. She saw in it not just Cain's attempt to protect his family, but a step in his own reconciliation. He was using the same hands that had created imbalance to now construct a fortress of balance. It was a desperate and noble effort to create a sanctuary where their unique lineage could survive and thrive, shielded from the attention of the forces that Cain, through his mark, could sense gathering more and more clearly at the edges of his perception, curious about the strange new light that had flared up in the middle of the chaotic land. The existence of the city of Enoch was not a secret that could be kept forever. In a universe of energy currents and resonant frequencies, the creation of a bastion of pure harmony in the midst of chaos was akin to lighting a great bonfire on a moonless night. It created a ripple, a clear and powerful signal that propagated through the realms, extending beyond the physical world and the world of echoes. And this unique energy wave eventually reached the ears of those who should never have heard it, the Watchers. These beings were not angels in the way humans might conceive. They were entities of pure order, of cold, dispassionate logic, created to observe the perfect mechanics of the cosmos, the great turning gears of galaxies, and the immutable laws of creation. But through eons of observing this unchanging perfection, a new sensation had begun to stir within them: boredom. They yearned for a variable, a disruption, something new and unpredictable. The signal emanating from the city of Enoch was precisely that. At first, they merely observed from a distance. They saw a being who bore the mark of chaos, attempting to build order. They saw a descendant of the Earth's primordial line, sacrificing herself to maintain balance. And most importantly, they saw a new bloodline, that of Enoch and his descendants, an unprecedented hybrid. This bloodline was not entirely of the material realm, nor entirely of the spiritual. It was a natural bridge, a perfect conduit. They were not drawn by the beauty of the daughters of men, as later tales would tell. Physical beauty was too mundane a concept for them. They were drawn to the beauty of potential, to the unique energy structure of this lineage. They saw in Cain's descendants a shortcut, a pre-opened door through which they could enter and experience the tangible world. A world of change, of sensation, of fascinating imperfection. The first contacts were subtle, not a grand visitation. They were whispers woven into the dreams of the most gifted inhabitants of Enoch. A musician, struggling for a new melody, would suddenly hear in his sleep a symphony of the celestial spheres, a tune so complex and enchanting it could move the souls of stones. A smith, trying to create a stronger alloy, would see in his mind images of starfire and the formulae for combining metals in previously unknown ways. These whispers promised knowledge, power, and creativity beyond human imagination. They asked for nothing in return, at least not at first. They simply gave. Cain, with his sensitive mark, was the first to feel the outside interference. He sensed a strange frequency, a cold, ancient, and calculating consciousness observing his city. It was different from the chaotic echoes of Nod. This energy was ordered, purposeful, and that made it all the more terrifying. He tried to warn his people, but how could he explain a threat that only he could perceive? To everyone else, their city was simply blossoming in a miraculous way. New inventions appeared. Art reached an unprecedented height. They saw it as a blessing, a result of the harmony the city provided. The Guardian also sensed the change. The city's symphony was no longer pure. Interspersed within it were alien notes, beautiful, but with a foreign timbre, a mechanical perfection that was not natural. She looked at her grandchildren, saw them enraptured by these gifts from the heavens, and a deep unease began to stir in her tranquil heart. The fortress they had so carefully built to protect themselves now seemed to be inviting in an unwelcome guest from a place far more distant and dangerous than they could ever imagine. The intervention of the Watchers, once mere whispers in dreams, now became a torrent of knowledge pouring into the city of Enoch. Cain's descendants, who carried the inherent sensitivity of their hybrid blood, were the first and most receptive vessels. Two among them, Jubal and Tubal-Cain, became exceptional conduits for these celestial gifts. Jubal, a man with the soul of an artist, no longer had to painstakingly seek melodies from the wind or the streams. Music was now bestowed upon him in vivid, lucid dreams. He dreamt he was floating between the stars, listening to the symphony of planetary orbits. When he awoke, he could replicate these cosmic melodies perfectly. He crafted new instruments, lyres with strings made of strange, resilient fibers, and flutes that could produce tones that sent listeners into a trance. Jubal's music held a phenomenal power. It did not just entertain, It could manipulate emotions, inspire courage, sow fear, or even heal minor wounds. The entire city became entranced by his compositions, unaware that their very souls were being subtly tuned by an alien will. Meanwhile, Cain, a man of practical mind and skilled hands, received different knowledge. He was no longer a simple smith. He was taught in visions about the very structure of matter. He learned to identify veins of rare metals deep within the earth merely by sensing their vibration. He was given the formulae to create alloys harder than any stone, lighter than any wood, and with a miraculous capacity to conduct energy. His forge no longer burned with wood charcoal, but with a cold, blue flame that could melt the most stubborn of ores. From his hands came perfect tools, razor-sharp weapons, and intricate jewelry of a kind never seen before. He forged plowshares that seemed to till the earth of their own accord and swords that could cleave a boulder without dulling their edge. The city of Enoch developed at a dizzying pace. Their civilization leaped forward millennia in just a few generations. Fields were cultivated with superior tools, structures were built with unparalleled efficiency, and everywhere the enchanting music of Jubal played. The people saw it as a golden age, a testament to the superiority of their lineage. But every gift from the Watchers came with an invisible price. This knowledge was not born of understanding and labor, but of passive reception. Slowly, the city's very nature began to change. The quiet harmony, its original purpose, was replaced by ambition and ostentation. People no longer built to protect and maintain balance. They built taller towers to display their power, to reach for the very stars that had given them their knowledge. Music was no longer used to soothe, but to stir crowds into frenzies during increasingly elaborate and strange rituals. Metals were forged less into tools and more into weapons, though they had no obvious enemies. Cain, growing old within his own fortress, saw the rot from within. He watched his grandchildren become arrogant, seeing themselves as demigods. The Mark within him screamed at the escalating imbalance. The city, the great instrument he and Enoch had so carefully built, was now being played out of tune, creating a jarring, offensive noise in the symphony of the cosmos. The Guardian grew ever more silent. She retreated to her garden, the only place where some harmony remained, but even there she could feel the encroaching corruption. She felt the pain of the earth as it was greedily mined for its metals, and she heard the dissonance in the souls of her own descendants. The pact she had made with her entire being was in danger of being broken, not by Cain, but by the very progeny she had sought to protect. The sanctuary had become a hub of power and ambition, a beautiful but venomous flower, poised for a final, terrifying transformation. The Watcher's patience had reached its limit. After generations of seeding knowledge and observing the transformation of the city of Enoch, they decided it was time for a more direct intervention. They no longer hid behind dreams and whispers. On a night when two moons, one real, one an echo, shone brightly over the land of Nod, they descended. They came not as winged, radiant angels, nor as monstrous demons. They took on tangible forms of perfect beings, tall and luminous, with skin that shone like mother of pearl, and eyes that held the cold wisdom of the stars. The people of Enoch, now accustomed to wonders, were not afraid. They welcomed these visitors from the heavens as gods, the benefactors who had granted them their greatness. The Watchers did not come to rule by force. They came to merge. They walked among the people, their gaze looking past the most beautiful women. They were searching for the individuals with the strongest concentration of Enoch's bloodline, those with the highest capacity for energy resonance. And they took those women as their wives. These were not unions of love or carnal desire. They were acts of deliberate, cosmic-level genetic experimentation. They sought to graft their own cold, ordered essence onto the volatile, potent human bloodline to create a new race, a perfect instrument through which they could fully interact with and manipulate the material world. The result of this union, an offense against every law of nature, was the birth of the Nephilim. They were not children. From birth, they were gigantic beings, a grotesque fusion of the ethereal beauty of their fathers and the human form of their mothers. They grew at a phenomenal rate, and soon giants walked the streets of Enoch. They possessed terrifying physical strength, the sharp intellect of the stars, and an unnerving emptiness in their souls. They were the embodiment of power without empathy, of knowledge without wisdom, driven by insatiable appetites for food, for power, for domination. They quickly became tyrants. The city of Enoch, once a center of art and technology, became the kingdom of the Nephilim. They ruled with an iron fist. Jubal's instruments now played only martial anthems praising their might. Tubal, Cain's alloys were forged into colossal sets of armor and devastating weapons. The people of Enoch, once proud and innovative, became their slaves, toiling to satisfy the endless demands of their giant masters. The harmony that Cain and Enoch had so painstakingly constructed was now completely shattered. The city was no longer an instrument of balance. It had become a war machine, a malignant tumor growing on the face of the planet. Cain, now a frail, white-haired old man, could only watch helplessly as his legacy was perverted and destroyed. He was a prisoner in the city he had built. The mark within him was no longer just a chaotic perception. It was a constant, agonizing pain that mirrored the extreme imbalance of the world around him. He saw the Nephilim not just as tyrants. Through his cursed eyes, he saw them as they truly were, walking voids, mobile tears in the fabric of reality, draining the life force from everything around them. The pact the Guardian had made with her life was now in tatters. Her union with Cain was meant to seal a single tear. But the union of the Watchers with her descendants had created hundreds of new ones. The imbalance had reached its absolute peak, and the cosmos could no longer ignore it. A great correction, a radical cleansing, was now inevitable. In the Garden of Echoes, now withered and grey, the Guardian stood under the silver leaf tree that no longer glowed. She did not need to look upon the outside world to know what was coming. She felt it in every fibre of the soil, in every drop of dew. She heard a terrible silence approaching, the silence that precedes a fury born not of a god, but of existence itself. She looked up at the sky, where clouds the color of dark slate were gathering from all corners of the world. But in those clouds, she felt no anger, no punishment. She sensed a profound sorrow, the grief of the planet itself, suffering from a wound too deep to heal. The earth was preparing to cleanse itself, like a body inducing a fever to destroy a sickness. The rain began to fall. The first drops were not heavy or violent. They were soft, descending like tears, carrying the sorrow of the cosmos. But then the rain grew heavier. The sky seemed to tear open, unleashing an impossible deluge. This was no ordinary storm. Each drop seemed to carry an intent to wash away. The water rose not as a punishment, but as a sad lullaby, a dirge for a world that had strayed too far from its path. The water rose to erase a terrible mistake, to fill the tears in reality, to submerge a lineage that had mixed with things not of this world. In the city of Enoch, chaos reigned. The giant Nephilim, who had thought themselves invincible, knew fear for the first time. Their incredible strength was useless against the fury of nature. They roared and bellowed, striking at the rising waters with their massive weapons, but it was all in vain. The water swept away the proud towers, submerged the forges that had created terrible weapons, and silenced the instruments that had played the music of corruption. The Watchers, who had started it all, could only look on from another realm, powerless against the most fundamental universal law they had sought to break. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Cain stood on the highest level of the central tower, watching the waters rise. He made no attempt to flee. He had lived too long, seen too much. His legacy was not just murder. His legacy was a door he had opened between worlds, an invitation that had led to this desolation. The flood was not the end he would have chosen, but perhaps it was the end the world needed. As the cold water licked at his feet, the chaos from the mark within him grew strangely quiet, as if it were being dissolved in the great cleansing. In his final moments, before everything went silent, his consciousness reached out toward the garden. He saw an image of the guardian, standing serenely, allowing the waters to envelop her. She was not dying. She was dissolving, returning to the primordial essence of the earth, becoming one with the song she had always protected. Their pact was complete. The original tier had been closed at an immeasurable cost. The flood was the universe's desperate, violent attempt to slam shut the door that the legacy of Cain had opened. Before the final silence fell, the guardian closed her eyes, listening to the last echo of a world about to be forgotten, a world of echoes, of pacts, and of a lineage that might once have bridged heaven and earth. And then there was only the sound of rain, and the beginning of a new, cleaner world.